say in the Black Panther Party that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary. And you're going to have to keep on saying that. You're going to
I hope you can hear that. I wonder if we can get it back up again and push it back, because this is Fred Hampton, assassinated by the cops in America, a leading and important member of the Black Panther Party. And one of the things that I have loved about encountering Fred, which I encountered Fred Hampton's work a long time ago, but over 20 years ago probably, and before videos, I've re-encountered Fred Hampton's work through YouTube and through the videos that have been on YouTube. One of the things that's been really interesting, beautiful, is this particular phrase. I just want to play it again when he's talking about this word.
We always say in the Black Panther Party that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary. And you're going to have to keep on saying that.
So those words on Fred Hampton's lips, I am a revolutionary. What you find sometimes if you look at the videos of Fred Hampton are points at which this is deployed as a call and response. So the I am is responded to with a revolutionary. And this becomes a kind of chant, becomes kind of mobilization of emotion and desire. It becomes something that we often encounter in a kind of religious context, in some sense, where people have call and responses. If anyone attends church rituals, they're probably familiar at some point with a kind of call and response dynamic that takes place. And it's a kind of strange dynamic. It's a very powerful dynamic, that call and response. And so when Fred Hampton is calling out the I am obviously here is something that, if you're from that particular kind of conversation I was talking about, the conversation of philosophy, the I am here is deeply echoing one of the instance moments and starting moments of modern philosophy, you know, the cogito from Descartes, the I think therefore I am. And at the point at which the crowd or the group respond with a revolutionary, so we have the I am a revolutionary. What we encounter is this kind of production of subjectivity, this kind of production of a sense of identity, this production of a sense of who we are in declaring who I am. And it echoes all kinds of moments in which this process is crucial. In America, it would echo, I imagine, the moment of McCarthyism, where the question, have you been or have you ever been or are you now a communist, is the kind of question that has to be responded to by a communist with that assertion that, yes, I am a communist. And in that moment, this kind of space of encounter between subjectivity and the collective is not intellectual. It's not, or rather, it's not organized simply intellectually. It's primarily organized through the mobilization of desire, through a kind of, we might say, courage, or through the heart, or through, you know, the body. We might use a whole series of other terms, but it's not a quiet conversation. It's not something that one, you know, usually whispers to oneself. It's something that one declares to the world. And I'm grateful for Machinadis's video message, because he was one of the things, and I'm going to have to kind of take a little bit of time to digest some of what Machinadis was saying to me. But one of the things he was talking about specifically was the way in which this kind of relationship of the voice of seeing and saying kind of connect to each other. And he talked at a little point in there about the way in which, you know, a magician or a sorcerer will or someone involved in a religious situation will, you know, use a phrase like "I call upon." And I'll later on I will just, you know, give an indication of a short little kind of prayer that pagans use to sort of show this in practice and show how it's working. And that relationship here of the way in which something is said, the way in which something is kind of brought out into the world, that relationship can't be reduced to simply kind of intellectual content. It's what's crucial about it is this relationship to what we might call the mobilization of desire. And without the mobilization of desire, I would probably argue at this point, sort of talking in my kind of as a revolutionary, someone who would say I am a revolutionary. Without the mobilization of desire, I fail to see how there's either any interest in like working towards communism, any interest in working towards a better state, or more importantly, how there's any possibility of ever getting, anything other than an armchair politics into action. People change things, move to change things from passion. This is what we say. And again, this is this idea of the mobilization of desire. But there's an intensely difficult problem, philosophically and politically, and even as a sorcerer, there's an intensely difficult problem when we encounter this relationship to desire. And this is kind of what I've been thinking about a bit. I think about this a lot, but this is kind of what I'm thinking about kind of in relationship to the work I'm doing with Eric. And so in the last couple of weeks, I've been trying to return to this question and you know, work out again what I might think about, what I might say about this. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, the difference between what a philosopher says at one point and another point is kind of, you know, it's kind of that kind of self-criticism or self-development is kind of crucial here. So, I mean, let's put bluntly what the problem with desire is, and the problem of mobilizing desire, which is that the mobilization of desire can very quickly go out of control. It can very quickly go somewhere we didn't want it to go. And so there's a tension between our relationship, particularly as a philosopher perhaps, to desire. But there's a tension also in terms of, you know, someone involved in politics. And so it's sort of that issue that I'm interested in kind of pursuing. Now, it's unsurprising perhaps that I'm interested in thinking about that. Anyone who wants to have a quite kind of like quick and easy description or summary of what Deleuze and Guattari, what the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari is, well, a quick and easy summary would be it's a philosophy of desire. And that's kind of relatively commonplace assumption or understanding of the way in which Deleuze and Guattari are kind of thinking. You know, they think a philosophy of desire. But that's, you know, it still leaves us with a lot of like assumptions that we're bringing into the play here. So the main one being, what the hell is desire? Because for most of us, desire is a kind of sexualized relationship to something you love, or a pleasure-based relationship to something you like, a kind of liking or hating. That's kind of what we think of as desire, or kind of perhaps what's thought of generally as desire. And that's not what Deleuze and Guattari necessarily think desire is. And it's also not necessarily what I think is the best way of thinking of desire. There's another way of thinking of desire, which is that desire is something generated by something you don't have. This is a kind of, it's often called the idea of lack, that something is lacking or missing, and that this is kind of the way in which desire operates. It's a way of our body responding to what's not there. And again, that's also a problem when we think of desire as always being something, you know, a desire for something that we don't have, and a desire to acquire something. That's also a problem when we talk about the word desire, because again, that's also relatively common. And again, it's not what Deleuze and Guattari mean. That's not what they mean by desire. And it's also not really what I think of as desire. I think perhaps one of the crucial things, first of all, is to wonder why we might, if we do, think that desire is fundamentally a human kind of thing or an animal kind. That kind of question might be important, because in some senses desire is an aspect of all organic life. Here we have to be difficult, because here we have to be careful, because when we extend a concept, and let's say I'm trying to sort of suggest that desire applies to plants as well as animals as well as humans. Desire applies to or life generally. We have to be careful when we extend a concept, because quite often what we're doing when we extend a concept is actually using it metaphorically in a wider range of areas. So in fact, we're kind of anthropomorphizing animals or plants in a sense, because we're using a concept of desire that really could only apply to humans, and we're kind of using it metaphorically in other areas. We do have to be careful when we try and extend a concept, that we're not imposing a false metaphorical use of it, that we're not, as it were, writing out what we're actually trying to encounter, like bits that aren't human. We're not trying to be anthropomorphize rather things in the world. So perhaps the first thing to do is try and think of a kind of way of understanding what desire is that can enable us not to kind of essentially use a hidden assumption that it's really a human thing and that we're anthropomorphizing. So I'm kind of thinking of something like desire is the process of connection. So that which connects things, that which makes things connect or enables the connections to take place. And here I'm trying to sort of think the idea that the connection here that I'm talking about isn't specific to human beings. It's not specific to animals and their needs. It's not specific to plants and their relationship. It's specific to, it's specific, as it were, to anything that is in a process of connection. And so that would include computer networks. It would include planets and their moons. It would include solar and cosmological relations. And so what we might call this kind of ontological concept of desire, a way in which being exists, a way in which things work, if you like, is one in which, as I say, desire is something like the process that enables connections, the thing that enables connection. Now that process or thing, that thing I'm talking about there, that's still a bit vague. But the second thing, for now, I'm kind of going to work with that, and we can see what kind of where that kind of goes, or how people take that. That's absolutely fine. But for now, let's just, when I'm talking about desire, I'm just talking about that thing which connects and that thing which enables connection. The second thing I think about desire, or the second thing I'd like to suggest about desire, given that that's what I mean by the word or the concept at this point, is that desire isn't here some kind of special force, something like super pure and supernatural. Perhaps more like a magnetic field or something like that. But there's a field of desire. Perhaps we might use the phrase "a field of desire." But so as I say, it's this connection process. It's that which enables the connection process. But the second point I want to kind of think about or put out there is that it's not a kind of ultimate natural process. It's not somehow the guiding hand of God behind everything, or it's not somehow the guiding hand of nature behind everything. It's not what we sometimes call the elan vital, or the spirit, the living spirit. That's not what desire is. It's not the breath of God or any of those kind of things. Rather, it's a kind of relational dynamic. It's something that occurs when and in that process of connection, and it's always very specific. So here's where there are difficulties. So I would use the phrase that desire is always engineered, and desire is always already engineered. By what I mean by that is that in the process of something connecting with something else, that link of desire that is, as it were, the way in which we might imagine the connection to exist. So there's kind of point A and point B, or node A and node B, and then there's some kind of relationship in between node A and node B, and it's this kind of relationship in between that I think of as desire. The way in which we encounter that desire is always very specific to the particular connections that it's made. It's engineered into being. It's kind of brought into being. It comes into being always as a particular kind of mechanism, a particular kind of connection, a particular kind of relation. So I actually think of it here as not just a kind of projection. It's not something that we're seeing in the world. These are things that occur in the world. Now, the difficulty there is the physicist might say, well, aren't these just physical forces then that you're talking about? And why aren't these just like the forces of gravity, or as someone suggested in the chat, why they're not the forces of magnetism? And that's kind of, for me, they kind of are. And so in a sense, that's kind of the interest here. That relationship, that thing that's enabling the connection between one thing and another, is very specific to each particular situation. So in a situation of gravitational dynamics, it's specific. In the situation of magnetic dynamics, it's there. There are supposedly four physical forces. It's specific in each of those situations, but it's also specific between each human. It's also specific between the plant and its environment. It's also specific between one society and another, between words and ideas. And so the idea that you hear is this kind of phrase that desire is engineered into being, or it's always already engineered into being. I think it's this kind of process that I'm interested in, and it's in understanding, or at least like thinking that as a model of the way in which things are connected, that we can begin to understand or work with the way in which desire in our kind of human life, so in the life of politics, let's say, in the life that Fred Hampton's talking about, then he's expressing in that phrase, the way in which that particular kind of desire can be coped with and dealt with. It's on that basis that I would say something like the following. So, given all those kind of problematic caveats as to what I mean by the word desire and what I mean by engineered, none of which have completely clarified anything by any means, I'm sure. It's on the basis of those kind of caveats, I want to say something like the following. So, desire isn't some kind of special force, somehow pure and natural, beyond the reach of the world around us. We cannot rely on desire to give access to a real subject. It's not as though I can be authentically myself beyond any social pressures and cues if I turn to desire. Desire is already engineered into being. It's already filled with Greeks. It's always swarming with invasions, repulsions, embracings, and bindings. Even if it's calmed, the quiet surface cannot help but refract the light of the world in varying degrees, causing a play of shadows. The fact that desire is always already engineered is not an excuse for passivity or quietism. It's not a reason to do nothing, as though nothing can be done. The engineering of desire proves that desire can be engineered. The fact that it's always constructed opens it to the possibilities of construction. To say that desire is engineered is to deny that it's a natural fact as it presents itself. It's to claim a mutability, a capacity for change within desire. It's a call to think the variations that might be played on a theme, a cry to reorganize desires, a demand to engineer desire. To say that desire is always already engineered is to open the possibility of engineering desire. It's necessary to be cautious here. Desire is engineered into being, and as such can be engineered, and yet it's not a clean slate. No tabula rasa here. Desire desires differentially. Its flows and connections aren't abstract idealities, they're not clean thoughts or pure desires. These are only further moments of desire engineered. Desires are always engineered. The question is only how we might engineer something from what has been engineered already. When Sartre claims that freedom lies in the small space that exists when we face the possibility of making something out of what we have been made into, he points to this curious potential. "Oh, make of me a body that questions," Fanon cries. Again, this moment of making, of engineering. It's worth noting here, too, that unlike Heidegger and the Sartre of being and nothingness, Fanon isn't taking the human body here as one that is already questioning. There is no special being that questions its being, and so no need to produce negation as the condition of possibility of questioning, as Sartre claims. Rather, to question is a potential, one that has been produced only virtually, such that we know or feel that we are questions, that there is questioning. That there are or have been questions cannot, however, guarantee that there is questioning. So that was just a short little bit of text that I was writing as part of this, and so I had to kind of give you that caveat and give you the bit that hasn't been written in order to even get anywhere near the bit that has been written. But I also want to continue a little bit with just some notes, which I haven't, again, at this point, haven't trying to write down into sentences. And one of the things I'm interested in here is in trying to show or trying to, let other people be involved with this process of trying to produce philosophy, which at its heart in our contemporary world involves trying to produce philosophical writing. And I think that's really problematic. It produces a particular way of doing philosophy. But it also opens up ways of thinking that can't exist very easily in conversational dynamics. There's something very important about the written poem, the memorized poem, that philosophical writing encounters, and that the person trying to work with philosophical writing is kind of is as it were utilizing that process of the phrase, particular kind of phrasing, a particular sentence. And so what I'm trying to do here in part tonight is just sort of show you like this practice of how I engage in philosophy. So there is also the content, however, of what I'm talking about. So that little reflective moment aside, at this point in my thought, I encounter this problem I mentioned earlier. I encounter this problem that the mobilization of desire, whilst apparently necessary, produces a really serious problem. And let me be more explicit about that, perhaps. And this is to draw on arguments made in 1,000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus. These are not, strictly speaking, my thoughts at this point. But one of the things that is discussed in those texts is that, and I don't want to put this too harshly because it is quite harsh, but one of the things that's discussed in that text is that essentially fascism is the most efficient, or has been so far, that's probably the better way of putting it, has been so far the most efficient way of mobilizing desires that we've encountered within the political field. And this, in fact, is the real danger of fascism. Not that it's somehow authoritarianism, or that's itself problematic, but that what we encounter with fascism is precisely highly efficient mobilization of desires. Now, for many people like myself on the left, for example, that seems to be almost counterintuitive. Or at the very least, they might reduce it to the idea that fascism just mobilizes hatred, which again would be an oversimplification. What's suggested in 1,000 Plateaus and in Anti-Oedipus in the discussions of fascism is that we as it were have no option if we're going to try and engage in change, particularly revolutionary change but to realize and recognize the relationship to the mobilization of desire as a kind of fundamental technique or means by which we might be able to make change, whilst at the same time recognizing that so far the most appalling example, the most noticeable example of the mobilization of desire that we've encountered inside politics is fascism. So we might think immediately the best thing to do here is to never mobilize desire, or to reject any kind of politics that engages in a mobilization of desire. And so we might reject, say, the revolutionary of Fred Hampton as, misplaced passion. So that's, on the one hand, one of the big problems that I think, I'm trying to think through myself and trying to work out how to express that in philosophical writing. I'm trying to encounter inside my own political work, inside as a revolutionary. There's another element here, which is that fascism is, as it were, the mobilization of the micro-political, which is another kind of way for the thing we might call, desire. This is a kind of jargon phrase from schizoanalysis and from anti-Oedipus and all that sort of stuff. But the micro-political, which is where we encounter desire, fascism is a mobilization of the micro-political, it's mobilization of desire. And on the other hand, subjectivity or individuality is a resistance to fascism. And I think this is the other thing that I, again, would trace back to schizoanalysis. And so subjectivity, individuality, these are, as it were, both, inherently connected into our contemporary politics of capitalism and our contemporary politics, as we now are calling it, neoliberalism. But at the same time, they are also a resistance, a continual kind of almost, and I don't want to use the word innate, but that's the word that's coming to mind, but a kind of almost automatic, but even that's got problems. But but in some sense, the subjectivity is a kind of resistance to fascism. And the difficulty here, the political difficulty, is that kind of subjectivity, that kind of individuality is, capitalism has become expert at capturing almost every expression of that particular moment. And being able, in a sense, the question is it even possible to retrieve the anti-fascist moment of resistance that we can encounter in individuality as a strategy to deal with what appears to be a kind of contemporary rise and problem of fascism within our contemporary politics? And this, as it were, tension of desire, tension within social desire, between fascist mobilization of group desire and the individual subjectivity resistance to that. That tension, I think, orientates much of contemporary politics and is a tension that the revolutionary, as it were, has to encounter, because, and this is again to make a claim or make a kind of statement that would need expanding, but in a sense, for me, the revolutionary lies beyond the dualism of fascism and the individual. It lies beyond that dualism. Communist revolutionary in particular, but anarchist revolutionaries, anarcho-communist revolutionaries, essentially that's what I'm talking about as a revolutionary. And so the revolution or the revolutionary lies beyond the sort of tension between the group and the individual. That's actually, if you understand or try and understand what it is to be a revolutionary by thinking in terms of those two dichotomies, then it's a massive category mistake. In other words, you will never be able to understand the conversation that those revolutionaries are having. You'll always be mistranslating. And so the revolutionary has this kind of problematic relationship to being part of and being separate from, that is not easily understood or articulated within our contemporary political situation. This, I suppose, is kind of my problem at the moment. So, for the revolutionary, the weakness of what we might call a micro-political politics, the weakness of that kind of approach to desire, the micro-political idea, is precisely, for the revolutionary, the weakness of that is precisely its efficiency for the fascist. That the fascist is capable so easily of mobilizing group dynamics and group desires is something that we almost, that the revolutionary kind of almost is repelled by, just like the individual or the subjective person or the person who expresses and re-emphasizes their individuality, because the revolutionary kind of encounters fascism as something that's arisen from capitalism, from within capitalism, as a solution to some of capitalism's problems. And so we encounter anti-fascism within this very, very difficult set of discourses, in which the primary discourse of anti-fascism is fundamentally one of mobilizing a kind of individuality and a kind of emphasis on subjectivity. And yet the practical encounter with fascism can't be one that's based on an individual. You cannot resist fascism as an individual, in terms of the political community. And in fact, any attempt to do so is almost kind of like just ridden over by the fascist ability to mobilize group dynamics. And at the same time, the individualists, when they perceive the revolutionary responses to try and mobilize groups and group desires, individualists feels that there's some sort of connection between that left mobilization of groups and collectivities. They feel like there's some sort of connection or similarity between that left mobilization of the people, of the mass, and they feel like that's the same as the fascist. It looks the same as the fascist, and the reason it looks the same is because both are mobilizing what we call the micro-political desire, and they're binding people together into groups. And that distinction, and that technique of binding into groups is being deployed on both sides. And one of the difficulties is, I think, for the left and for the revolutionary, is that its tools of binding are archaic, and it has very little choice it can make between binding everybody on the ground of being an individual, because that's a kind of keying into the anti-fascist dynamic, the anti-fascist desire. It has very little choice between that kind of process of going, we're all individuals, we're all great individuals, and we're all good lefties or good liberals or whatever. And it has, or it has a kind of a subjugation dynamic, in which everyone is subjugating their individuality for the party or for history, or for, what does archaic mean? Old-fashioned, out of date, no longer working, out of context in our modern world. That's what I would mean by the archaic. So the left discussions you see, the left kind of conversations you see, end up being kind of very confused when it comes to this question of desire. And I think part of that comes down to the fact that we're perhaps unwilling to really get into the nitty-gritty of quite what it is to mobilize desires outside of capitalist framework in which they're organized between the individualistic, subjective, anti-fascist desire, or the group dynamic collective of the fascist desire. And I think this problematic is essentially kind of one of the central problematics that I'm thinking through, as are a lot of people. I'm fucking not unique in any way, by any means, with this. So I'm gonna kind of move a little bit now, because I want to just, and I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to kind of just finish a little bit this last 10 minutes by just coming back to almost what might be thought of as academic philosophy. Okay, so I mean, I don't want to suggest that philosophy has the answers here, and that it can tell politics how to deal with desire. I don't want to suggest that at all. But what I do want to suggest is that in thinking about the way in which this concept of desire is articulated in different spaces, then we can maybe begin to find resources for thinking about how we mobilize desire now, particularly how we mobilize desire. If, like me, you're interested in mobilizing desire against fascism, but you might just be interested in mobilizing desire for a better world, or for something else. So in philosophy we have it's a very old problem, and it's existed for a long time, and it's a relationship between desire and belief, or a coupling between desire and belief. And the argument is something like that the reasons for actions can't ever be simply intellectual. They're always going to have to be they're always going to have to involve what we might call a belief and a desire. So we're always going to say something like the motivations for any action by any agent are going to involve two elements. A belief that X will lead to Y. Belief, let's say, that walking down to the shops that has milk in it will enable me to buy a pint of milk, and the desire for Y. In other words, I want a pint of milk. So unless you have both the belief, that can be organized as to how you get something, and the desire to get that thing, unless those two elements are there, then you don't have a reason for action. And so that a reason in this situation, and this is, as I say, this is relatively common inside, even inside analytical philosophy. In fact, I would say this is probably an analytical philosophy distinction in some ways. But the idea of reasons when it comes to people is that a reason here is always going to have this element of both the desire and the belief. And only with both of those kind of in alignment will you actually have a reason. And that's a kind of thing, that kind of thing is important to notice, because obviously most of the time we consider reasons to be relatively intellectual. And there's been a lot of dispute down the years. So, just some basic kind of divisions that we can encounter as to how these are thought. Because obviously if you've got belief and you've got desire, you've not always got them in balance, and one might be more important than the other. And so someone like Aristotle, for example, would say that we desire X, we desire the milk because it's good. And so there's this kind of relationship between desire and belief, in which reason, if you like, or the belief thing, reason is master, and it needs the cooperation of it. Whereas someone like Hobbes is going to argue that desire is the master, and reason, what we give as reasons, what we give as our beliefs, these are just excuses. They're just what the technical term would be exculpation. So it's a kind of they're not really explanations. They're kind of excuse explanations. Probably the easiest way of thinking of what an exculpation is. They're stories we tell ourselves as to why we're doing something. That's what Hobbes would say. And it's actually our desires that are really key, and we're just telling ourselves little pretty stories about why we're doing something. As I say, whereas Aristotle is going to think that actually we're only really going to desire things because they're kind of good, and that's kind of the dynamic that we're involved in. And so, the options are desire is really the thing in charge, and the belief or the reason that we give for our actions is actually an excuse, and so it's a slave, or that the reasons are actually in charge and the desires are kind of they're being made to obey. And this tension between desire and belief has been relatively common inside philosophy since Aristotle. But what's crucial to remember, or what's crucial to think about, is that distinction doesn't exist inside Plato, and it doesn't exist inside the works in particular, in the same way it doesn't exist inside the works of let's call them the Greeks. I mentioned earlier in that little bit of text that I was reading out, I used the phrase, desire is always already engineered into being. It's already filled with Greeks. And I was thinking of the Trojan horse at that point, filled with Greeks, but also that the question of desire is filled, in a sense, with the way in which the Greeks dealt with it. And so one of the things that's crucial about Plato is that Plato and Aristotle are a point at which our concepts of desire are completely transformed and changed. So for Aristotle, there are four kind of elements of, as it were, the human being. There's reason, there's desire, there's sensation, and there's nutrition. It's a bit simplistic, but there's kind of, you can kind of see the stuff. There's your mind, there's the things you want, there's the things you feel, and there's the stuff you kind of eat and need. So there's kind of these four elements, and in desire, in this notion of desire, he has different aspects of that, 3 different aspects of that as it happens. And so the human being, for someone like Aristotle, desire is kind of one element there, whereas for someone like Plato, that's not the case. And in fact, there's a guy called Charles Kahn that I was reading, and it was really interesting to read through the way in which he describes this. One of the things he describes is that Plato has no word for desire. This isn't a concept that exists in the Platonic structures. And I think this is kind of very, very interesting. And what he means by this is there's no generic concept of desire. For someone like Aristotle, there's a generic concept of desire in which there's different kind of species. There are genus and a species. So you've got a big category and you've got different bits inside them. And so you've got a big category, the genus, and the different bits inside them, the elements of the species. So for someone like Aristotle, there's desire as a genus, and then there are different species of desire. You know, the kind of sexual desire you might have, the intellectual desire, you know, community desire. And there's a whole sort of series of different elements. Whereas for Plato, each of the ways in which we encounter desire is specific to itself, and they kind of organise and are kind of connected into themselves. And so whilst for Aristotle there's three species of desire, there's no genus for Plato, and so there's not species of desire. Each of them, as I say, to use that phrase, is engineered already into its own specific concept, into its own specific formation. And so one of the things we've got here is a kind of, like, we can see within an intellectual moment the way in which a concept is being transformed. And how I'm interested in the way in which that particular sort of way in which Plato kind of articulates his concept of desire. I'm interested in the specifics of that. Unfortunate word to use, perhaps. I'm interested in the way in which he does that. But the point I'm kind of more interested in just making at the moment is that there is this kind of this reorganization of the concept between Plato and Aristotle. And what this reorganization does is it prevents us from being able to see something. It prevents us from being able to see what it is that Plato is actually talking about, because we see it in retrospect through this kind of Aristotelian eyes. We see it in retrospect through this kind of way of thinking of desire as a kind of genus that has specific differences, you know, specific ways of being instantiated. And I think the same kind of dynamic now exists in some sense in terms of the way in which we encounter things like politics of desire, mobilization of desire, the way in which desire has been articulated inside politics and modern philosophy, in part as a result of its introduction by Deleuze and Guattari, but in part kind of still infected by this idea that there's a kind of a thing that we can, as I was trying to at the start, a thing that we can call generically desire, and in which there's specific kind of instantiations of it. So that's why, in a sense, I was trying to talk about this kind of incongruous moment in which desire is always engineered. The kind of process of trying to produce a concept that is disruptive to that way in which we might already be using a concept. And again, obviously, inspired. I mean, I'm not being enormously original here. This is just working on a schizoanalytic background. Anyway, I'm going to kind of wind it up there, because there'll be more, no doubt, on this relationship to desire, and that I want to sort of get to and talk about. So as I was saying at the start, if you're interested in sort of what I'm trying to do is have a space for sort of philosophical practice and conversation that kind of is not unacademic, but it's not simply academic. And as I say, my interests are both politics, revolutionary politics, philosophy and sorcery. So that's kind of the sort of setting and the framework. But if you're interested in being involved at all, or you feel like you want to say something, or you feel like you want to ask a more extended question, or just, you know, express yourself in your own way in terms of a response, because conversations are sometimes good, but sometimes, you know, different lines of thought just crossing over can also be good. But if you're interested in doing that, use a Discord that is available. Connections are available through the Twitch, twitch.tv/razorsmile. It's available there. It's also available on lots of my other social media, and you can connect to that if you want to. So yeah, use that Discord space. And I will try and get in next week, and we'll hopefully I'll be having a little bit of a conversation with someone next week, and we'll see how things go as it goes week by week. And so, as I say, this is an experiment. No idea necessarily what's happening next week, but I'll try and have a bit more of a conversation as well. Is that all? I think that's all. I can't think of anything else that I was particularly wanting to bring up tonight. Okay. Have a good one, everyone, and maybe I can see you next week.